The city outside was a symphony of its own, but in the rehearsal room, the only music that mattered was the one they were trying to nail down for the third time that hour. She sat at the upright piano, her fingers moving over the keys with a quiet certainty that seemed at odds with the growing frustration in the room. The vocal group, a trio of young men with sharp suits and sharper harmonies, was stuck on a tricky transition from the top of the bridge. Again, said the lead singer, rubbing his temple. It's not sliding right. She didn't sigh, she just gave a small, understanding nod, her hands already repositioning. This was her job, to listen, to adapt, to support. She played the intro chords, her left hand laying down a warm, walking bass line that gave the singers something solid to stand on. Her eyes were on the sheet music, but her ears were everywhere, tuning into the slight flatness of the second tenor, the rushing of the baritone. As they sang, her right hand subtly emphasized a harmonic clue, guiding them around the corner of the difficult chord change. This time, it locked. Yes, that's it, the lead singer exclaimed, a grin breaking across his face. You heard that? That was it. She allowed herself a small smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. It was all you, she said, her voice soft but clear. They laughed, knowing it wasn't entirely true, but appreciating her for saying it. This was the dynamic. They were the flash, the voices out front under the bright lights. She was the architecture behind it, the foundation. Few in the audience would ever know her name, but without her, the structure might wobble. Later, as she packed her simple music satchel, sheet music, a pencil, a well-worn metronome, the manager, a man with a permanent air of busyness, poked his head in. Great work today. Listen, that gig tonight at the party, it's a big deal, huge. After the Spectrum Awards, the room will be packed with, well, with everyone. He said the word with reverence. The boys will do 2 short sets. Standard backing trio will be their bass, drums, guitar. He paused, and for a moment she looked up, a faint hope flickering. You should come, as part of the team. But just be ready. We might not need you to play the piano. There is more for show, you know, decoration. But stick close, just in case. The flicker went out. She nodded again, the same professional, accommodating nod. Of course. I'll be there. Good, good. He was already halfway out the door. Wear something nice. Her apartment was small, a sanctuary of sorts. The most important thing in it was her piano, a decent but not spectacular instrument that bore the marks of countless hours. She changed, choosing a simple, elegant dress that wouldn't draw attention. She looked at herself in the mirror, a serious face, thoughtful eyes, a presence that was calm and steady. She wasn't built for the glare of the spotlight. She was built for the depth of the music itself. Before leaving, she sat at her own piano and played for 10 minutes, not a song, just patterns, cascading notes, complex chords that bloomed and resolved, a private language between her and the instrument. It was how she remembered who she was. Under the title of accompanist, the brownstone in the Upper East Side was everything the manager promised. Light spilled from its windows. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilled onto the street where a line of sleek cars idled. The air inside was thick with perfume, cigar smoke, and the electric hum of fame. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, unseen. There they were, the faces she'd only seen on album covers or in magazines. The Queen of Soul herself, holding court with a dazzling smile. A legendary rock guitarist casually leaning against a wall. A comedian whose voice she recognized instantly from the radio. And there, in the center of the main room, was the piano. It was a grand, a beautiful, glossy ebony beast, a work of art. It sat on a slight raised area, a silent monarch. People leaned on it, placed their drinks on it, which made her wince internally. But no one played it. It was a trophy, a piece of the scenery. She found a corner near a large potted fern, a good spot to observe without being observed. She watched her trio perform, slick and energetic, backed by the professional trio. They sounded good. The crowd gave them polite, appreciative applause. They were the appetizer. After their set, they melted into the party, glad to be part of the scene. She remained in her corner. She listened to the conversation swirling around her, talk of deals, of tours, of who was recording what with whom. It was a world of business and persona. Then, her ear, her trained musician's ear, caught a different thread. A small group had gathered near the piano. In its center was an older saxophonist, a man whose name was synonymous with the very history of modern jazz. His face was a map of experience, his eyes sharp. He held a glass, but his gestures were about music, and that's what's missing. He was saying, his voice a low, gravelly instrument, the feeling, the story, too many notes, not enough heart. It's become arithmetic, a younger, well-dressed producer chuckled. Come on, maestro. You set the bar too high. Nobody plays like that anymore. The saxophonist shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. They just don't listen. They play to impress, not to express. He took a sip. Music isn't in the fingers first, it's here. He tapped his chest. It was a conversation she'd heard in 100 rehearsal rooms, but never in a room like this. It felt real. Amidst all the glitter, she found herself agreeing silently, drawn to the raw truth of it. She was so focused on his words she didn't notice his gaze slowly scanning the room, moving past the famous faces, looking for something, or someone. The producer waved a hand, playful. All right, professor, give us a lesson. Show us this feeling. A small smile played on the saxophonist's lips. He wasn't going to take the bait, not directly. He wasn't a party trick, but his eyes kept moving. They passed over the laughing singer, the preening guitarist, and then they stopped. They landed on the quiet woman in the simple dress, half hidden by the fern, her posture straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She had the look not of a fan, not of a socialite, but of someone who knew, someone who listened with more than just her ears. He pointed. The conversation around him hushed. The pointing finger of a jazz legend was a powerful thing. He said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the party. All the eyes in his circle followed his direction and landed on her. A few people nearby stopped talking, sensing a shift. The pianist from the rehearsal. I've seen you. You look like you can tell a story. He gestured with his glass towards the magnificent, untouched grand piano. Let's hear what you've got. Show us if the piano in this fancy place actually works. As silence, deep and sudden, crashed over their section of the party. It was the kind of silence that pulls sound from the air. Dozens of faces, famous and powerful, turned to look at her. The queen of soul paused, glass in hand. The rock guitarist straightened up. The manager of her trio, from across the room, looked over in pure panic. In that terrifying, expanded moment, every instinct told her to shrink, to decline politely, to vanish back into the wallpaper. This wasn't her role. This wasn't the plan. She was the just in case. And the case had not been called. But then she looked at the piano, not as a decoration, but as an instrument. She looked at the saxophonist, not as an untouchable icon, but as a musician issuing a challenge, about feeling. And she felt a spark, deep down where her private music lived. It was a small, defiant flame. Without a word, she stepped out from the shadow of the fern. The crowd seemed to part for her. She walked the short distance to the grand piano, the click of her heels on the floor the only sound in the world. She reached it, and for a moment, just placed a single, respectful hand on its polished lid. It felt alive, even in its silence. She slid onto the bench, adjusted it slightly. Her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the keys, a landscape of black and white. She took a deep, steadying breath that seemed to draw the room's energy inward, focusing it on that single spot. Then, her hands came down, not with a flourish, but with a deep, resonant, soulful chord. It wasn't fast, it wasn't flashy, it was a statement, it was a feeling. And from the very first note, the party was over. Something else had begun. The sound that came from the piano wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't a clever jazz standard to show off her speed. It wasn't a popular tune to win them over. It was a slow, deep, almost mournful procession of chords. They were rich and full, rooted in the church, in the soil. They spoke of long days and hard truths. Her left hand laid a foundation that felt ancient, a slow, walking heartbeat. Her right hand painted simple, aching melodies over the top. Notes that bent and sighed like a human voice. That first, soulful chord had acted like a spell. The remaining chatter in the room sputtered out. Heads turned, not with polite interest, but with a sudden, deep focus. The saxophonist who had called her out didn't smile. He just crossed his arms, his head tilting to one side, his eyes narrowing to slits. He was listening, really listening. She played for a minute, maybe two, building this gospel-tinged world. It was a confession, an opening up. You could hear a glass being set down carefully on a table. You could hear the rustle of a dress as someone shifted forward. The famous soul singer, who had built her own legend on pure feeling, stopped smiling her party smile. Her expression became still, her eyes fixed on the woman at the piano. She recognized this language. It was the language of real. Then, without warning, the woman at the piano shifted. The slow, soulful progression evaporated. In its place, a flurry of notes erupted, precise, complex, and lightning fast. It was a song called Giant Steps, a famous tune by a saxophone legend, known as a kind of musical obstacle course. For musicians, it was a test. Its chords changed at a terrifying, almost mathematical speed. Many players tackled it like a math problem, their faces tight with concentration. But that's not what she did. She didn't just play the notes, she attacked them. Her right hand became a blur, but every single note had purpose and a biting, bluesy edge. Her left hand wasn't just keeping time, it was punching out chords that propelled the melody forward like an engine. She wasn't solving a puzzle, she was telling a thrilling, complicated story with it. Her body, which had been so still, now moved with the music, a slight sway, a dip of the shoulder. Her face was intense, absorbed, but there was a joy in it, a kind of fierce release. The saxophonist uncrossed his arms. He leaned forward, his earlier challenging posture gone, replaced by the stance of a student, or a hunter who has just seen rare prey. He started nodding, not to the beat, but to the phrases, to the ideas she was spinning. He was following her logic, hearing the history in her playing the church, the swing bands, the modern bebop revolution, all woven together seamlessly. Over by the wall, the renowned rock guitarist had taken a few steps closer. He wasn't watching the party anymore. He was staring at her hands, studying the shapes they made on the keys. A slight, appreciative smirk touched his lips. He played with raw power, but this was a different kind of power, one of intricate control and fearless improvisation. The party's atmosphere had completely transformed. The room was no longer a collection of separate conversations and cliques. It had become an audience, drawn to a single point of gravity. A famous comedian, known for his constant, witty chatter, was utterly silent, his chin resting on his hand. The manager of the vocal trio stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. His just-in-case pianist was holding the entire room, filled with the toughest critics on the planet, in the palm of her hand. She built the tension higher and higher. The runs of notes became more daring, the spaces between them more dramatic. She wasn't just showing off her technique, she was playing with it, teasing the melody, breaking it apart and putting it back together in new ways. She took the song, this well-known test piece, and made it entirely her own. It was a declaration. Then, she began her descent. The frantic pace gradually eased. She started to bring back some of that original, soulful feeling, weaving it into the complex tapestry. It was like she was coming home after a long, incredible journey. The music softened, became more reflective. The last minute was pure, lyrical beauty, a series of chords so rich and perfectly resolved they felt like a conclusion to a long argument, one that ended in understanding. Her final chord was not loud. It was a soft, resonant cluster of notes that she let hang in the air, using the pedal to let it shimmer and fade slowly into silence. She lifted her hands and placed them gently in her lap. She kept her head bowed for just a second, coming back to herself, back to the room. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a full, thick silence, charged with the energy of what had just happened. It lasted for 2 full seconds, maybe 3. Then, it broke. The applause didn't start with a clap. It started with a loud hoo from the back of the room. Then the saxophonist, the man who had started it all, was clapping hard, a wide, genuine grin spreading across his face. The rock guitarist joined in, nodding vigorously. The soul singer was applauding, her eyes bright. The sound swelled into a roar, not the polite, obligated applause from earlier, but a loud, explosive, cheering ovation filled with whistles and shouts of "yeah!" And again. This was approval from the highest court. They weren't applauding because it was polite. They were applauding because they had been moved, because they had witnessed something true. The woman at the piano finally looked up. A flush of color was on her cheeks. She seemed almost surprised by the noise, as if she'd forgotten where she was. She offered a small, shy, but deeply proud smile to the room. The saxophonist didn't wait for the applause to die down. He moved through the crowd, people patting him on the back as if he'd discovered a hidden treasure. He reached the piano and stood beside it, looking down at her. He put a hand on her shoulder, a firm, solid grip. "All right," he said, his gravelly voice quiet but carrying. The applause finally began to subside, everyone straining to hear. "All right now, who are you?" She looked up at him, the intensity from her performance still in her eyes, but now mixed with a dazed humility. I play for the vocal group," she said, as if that explained anything. He shook his head, the grin not fading. No, that's what you do. That's not who you are. What's your name? She told him. He repeated it slowly, as if tasting the word. You can play, he stated, the simplest and highest compliment from a man like him. You really can play. Why are you hiding in the background? Before she could even form an answer, others were closing in. The well-dressed producer was there, handing her a card. I have a session next Tuesday at Columbia. 3 hours. I need that feeling. Can you be there? The saxophonist waved him off, but gently. She's busy. She's going to be at my rehearsal tomorrow. He looked back at her. You are? No arguments. A club owner, a man with a sharp suit and sharper eyes, edged in. I run the loft downtown. The real listeners come. I want you for a weekend. Next month. Name your price. The woman just sat on the piano bench, surrounded by legends, offers and questions swirling around her like snow. Her manager finally pushed his way through, his face a mixture of shock and new, greedy calculation. She's under contract for the trio's tour he started. The saxophonist fixed him with a look that could freeze water. That, he said, nodding toward the piano, is not a background singer's accompanist. That is a solo artist. You rework that contract tonight. The party had found its new center. All the earlier pretense was gone. People wanted to talk to her, to hear her speak, to be near the source of that music. The piano was no longer a decoration. It was a landmark. And she was no longer the woman by the fern. She was the musician. In 12 minutes, her entire world had been turned inside out. The door hadn't just opened. It had been blown clean off its hinges. The morning after the party, the world outside her window looked exactly the same. The sun hit the brick buildings on her street the same way. The sounds of the city waking up were no different. But inside her small apartment, everything had changed. It was like the air itself held a new charge. She sat at her own piano, not playing, just resting her fingers on the cool keys. The memories of the night before played in her mind like a film reel. The silence before the first chord, the faces listening, the roar afterward. It didn't feel entirely real. It felt like something that had happened to someone else. But the business card from the producer was on the side table. The scribbled address and time for the saxophonist's rehearsal was in her small notebook. These were real. The phone had rung early that morning, her manager's voice buzzing with a new, sugary energy. We need to talk. Big things. Don't sign anything until we talk. She had quietly hung up, needing the silence. Later that day, she took the subway downtown to the rehearsal space the saxophonist had given her. It was in an older building, the hall smelling of dust and old wood. She could hear the music before she even opened the door, a familiar, complex rhythm. The sound of his saxophone like a crying voice, weaving through the drums and bass. She paused outside, that old feeling of being an outsider creeping in. This was his band, his legendary group. What was she doing here? She knocked softly and opened the door. The music stopped. The saxophonist lowered his horn and turned. The other musicians, a bassist with a kind face, and a drummer who looked like he'd seen it all, glanced over. There she is, the saxophonist said. No smile, but his eyes were warm. Come in. You met everyone last night in the chaos. He gestured to the others. We're working on something new. It's not finished. I want you to listen. She found a stool in the corner and sat, folding her hands in her lap. This was a role she understood, the listener. He raised his saxophone and they began again. The piece was turbulent, searching. It moved from moments of gentle beauty to passages of intense, almost angry energy. It was clearly a work in progress, a path being cut through a jungle. They played it through once, then stopped, arguing good-naturedly about a transition. The saxophonist ran a hand over his head, frustrated. It's not landing. It's clever, but it's not landing. He turned to her, suddenly. You at the piano. What did you hear? All eyes were on her again. But this was different. This was the workshop, not the stage. It was about the work. She swallowed, choosing her words carefully. The shift from the second theme back into the fast part. It feels like a jump. Like the floor falls out. Maybe she hesitated. Maybe it needs just 2 chords in between. Something to bridge the feeling. Not just the notes, but the mood. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded at the grand piano in the room. Show me. She got up and went to the piano. She played the last few bars of the gentle section as she remembered them, then added 2 of her own chords, not flashy, but deeply sad, questioning chords that yearned for resolution. Then she led naturally back into the furious tempo. The bassist grunted. Yeah, that's it. That's the glue. The saxophonist didn't say anything. He just put his saxophone to his lips and played over what she had done, his melody wrapping around her chords like a vine. It worked, it felt complete. He lowered his horn. "All right," he said, simply. "You're in. Learn the rest of it. We play it tonight at the club." And just like that, she was part of it. The rehearsal wasn't about her proving herself anymore. It was about building the music together. He was a demanding leader. Hearing things in his head he struggled to explain, but she found she could often translate. She would play a cluster of notes, and he'd point and say, "That," but darker. It was a conversation without words. That night at the famous jazz club, the air was thick with smoke and anticipation. The crowd knew the saxophonist's music, knew his history. When the band walked out and she took her seat at the piano, there were murmurs. Who was this new person? When the first set began, traditional tunes, she played her part perfectly supportive, swinging, never stepping out of line. The audience appreciated it. Then, in the second set, he nodded toward her. "That new thing we worked on," he said to the crowd, his voice a low rumble into the microphone. "This is for a friend of mine." He didn't look at her, but she knew. They launched into the piece they had rehearsed. When they hit the bridge, the part she had helped fix, she played her to chords. In the context of the full band, with the drums rolling like thunder and the bass vibrating the floor, those chords sounded huge. They were the emotional heart of the entire piece. After the song, as the applause washed over them, the saxophonist did something he rarely did. He turned from the microphone and walked over to her at the piano. He put a hand on the curve of the wood and gave her a small, solemn bow of his head. The crowd saw it. They erupted louder. It was a public blessing, a passing of the torch in front of everyone who mattered. After the gig, back in the cramped dressing room, the feeling was easy. The bassist was packing up his instrument. "You fit," he said to her, not looking up. "Good feel." The saxophonist was wiping down his saxophone. He looked at her reflection in the small, lit mirror. "The studio session tomorrow with that producer," he said. "You should do it. But play your own thing. Don't just play his. He'll ask for a standard. Give him one of yours." She went to the famous recording studio the next day. It was intimidating. A huge room with a perfect piano and glass separating her from the control booth where the producer and several other important-looking men sat. The producer's voice came through the speaker. "So glad you could make it. Let's start with something easy. How about Body and Soul? Just a simple run-through to get levels." She remembered the saxophonist's words. "Play your own thing." She nodded, but inside, she made a decision. When the red light went on, she didn't play the standard as written. She took its beautiful, old melody and she rebuilt it from the ground up. She started with a simple, childlike music box pattern in the high notes, then descended into the lower register with chords that were so modern and strange. They made the engineer look up from his board. She deconstructed the song, exploring every shadowy corner of its harmony, before finally, triumphantly, bringing it all back home to the familiar tune. It was a 7-minute journey. When she finished, there was silence in the booth. Then the speaker crackled. The producer's voice was different now, quiet, serious. What was that middle section? Can you do that again?" She shook her head. "Probably not the same way." A slow smile spread across his face behind the glass. "Even better." He turned to the men next to him. "We're not cutting a single note of that. We're building an album around that." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind, but a quiet one. Her life became a cycle of the club with the saxophonist's band, and the studio for her own recordings. The manager of the vocal group, after a few tense meetings where the saxophonist was present, quietly revised her contract. She was no longer their employee. She was a featured collaborator, free to come and go. She and the saxophonist started spending more time together outside of music, not at fancy parties, but at small cafes or walking in the park. They talked about everything: philosophy, spirituality, art, life. He was a deep thinker, always searching, and he found in her a kindred spirit. She wasn't intimidated by his fame. She was challenged by his mind. He wasn't charmed by her talent alone. He was moved by her quiet strength. One afternoon, they were in his apartment, a place filled with books and records. He was playing a recording of a classical Indian musician on a strange, droning instrument. She listened, her eyes closed, hearing the layers, the rhythms within rhythms. "You hear that?" he said, his voice eager. "That's the future. That sound. Not just jazz, not just blues. Something bigger." She opened her eyes. "It's like a prayer." He looked at her, a long, quiet look. "Yes," he said softly. Exactly. He reached over and took her hand. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was a simple, solid connection. Her fingers, usually so flighty on the keys, were still in his. In that silence, with that otherworldly music filling the room, something settled. The partnership that had begun at a piano in a crowded room had found its footing in the quiet. It was no longer just about music. It was about two paths merging into one new, unexplored road. The seasons changed, painting the city in new colors, but the rhythm of their life had found its own steady beat. It was no longer a whirlwind, but a purposeful flow. They worked. They explored. They built a world together, brick by brick. Her album was finished. It was a quiet, powerful statement. The producer had been true to his word. He'd built the whole record around her unique vision. The cover was simple, just a photograph of her in profile, looking down at piano keys, her expression one of deep concentration. There were no catchy titles, no attempts to sell her as a singer. It was an album for listeners. When the first copies arrived, she held one in her hands, running her fingers over the grooves in the vinyl. It felt solid, real. The saxophonist took it and put it on his turntable. They sat together on his worn sofa and listened to the whole thing in silence. When the last note faded, he simply said, "That's you. That's all you." He was working harder than ever, pushing his own music into terrifying new places. His playing was becoming more fierce, more spiritual, a cry for something beyond the world. The clubs were sometimes too small to contain the sound. She was his anchor in that storm. On the bandstand, she provided not just harmony, but a foundation of peace for his explorations. Off the stage, she was the calm in his increasingly turbulent life. He was a seeker, and the searching was taking a toll. The pressure, the expectations, the constant drive to create wore him thin. She would find him late at night, staring at sheet music as if it were a foreign map, frustration lining his face. "Listen," she would say softly, and she would sit at the piano and play a simple, repeating pattern, a mantra. He would pick up his horn and try to answer it, to find a melody in the spaces she left for him. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but she was always there, not with easy answers, but with a steady presence. They decided to get married. It wasn't a big, flashy event. It was a small ceremony with a few close friends from the music world: the bassist, the drummer, the kind-faced producer. They exchanged simple bands. Her wedding gift to him was a new composition, a swirling, beautiful piece she called "Lord, Help Me to Be." He listened with his eyes closed, and when she finished, he had no words. He just held her hand tightly. After the marriage, things shifted again, but in a subtle way. She was no longer the new pianist in his band. She was his partner, in every sense. Their musical conversations deepened. They began to write together, truly together. He would bring a melodic phrase, a seed of an idea, humming it over breakfast. She would take it to the piano, give it roots and soil, and grow it into a structure where his saxophone could climb and bloom. Her own album began to find its audience. It didn't make the pop charts. It was discovered in small, serious record stores, played on late-night radio shows dedicated to the new thing. Young musicians, especially other pianists, would buy it and wear out the grooves. Trying to figure out how she made those sounds, she started getting letters. Thoughtful letters from people who said her music had gotten them through a hard time, or opened a door in their mind. This meant more to her than any sales figure. She was building something, not just a career, but a connection. His health began to worry everyone. The pace he kept, the intensity with which he lived and played, was not sustainable. There were whispers, concerned looks among their friends. She saw the changes up close, the fatigue that took longer to shake off, a new fragility beneath the powerful exterior. She tried to get him to rest, to slow down, but slowing down was a foreign language to him. The music was a train, and he had to stay on it. They took a trip together, just the two of them, to a quiet place by a lake. For a few days, there was no piano, no saxophone, just the water and the trees and the silence. He seemed to breathe easier there. He held her hand as they walked, and he talked not about music, but about the color of the light on the waves, the sound of the wind in the pines. It was a glimpse of a different kind of life, a peaceful one. But the city and the music called them back. There was a big concert planned, a benefit. It was an important event, and he insisted on doing it. Back in the city, the old rhythm seized him again. The night before the concert, he was rehearsing alone, pushing himself. She could hear it from the next room. The sound was urgent, almost desperate. On the day of the concert, he was quiet, pensive. As they got ready to leave the apartment, he stopped her at the door. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face as if memorizing it. "No matter what happens," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "you keep playing. You understand? You keep going. The music needs you." She felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Don't talk like that. We're going to play together tonight." He just kissed her forehead, a soft, lingering kiss. "We will." The concert hall was packed, buzzing with anticipation. The energy was immense. When they walked on stage, the applause was a physical wave. They played the first few numbers, and he was on fire. His playing was transcendent, a pure channel of energy. She watched him from the piano, pouring all of her strength into supporting him, lifting him up. During a particularly furious solo, she saw him wince, just for a second, but he played right through it. This started the final song of the set, one of their collaborations. It began with a long, beautiful piano introduction, just her. She created a world of shimmering sound, a peaceful galaxy. Then, his saxophone entered, not with a blast, but with a mournful, lyrical cry that wrapped around her notes. It was a conversation of pure love and understanding. The audience was utterly still. Halfway through his solo, it happened. His sound, which had been flowing like a river, choked. He stopped playing. The band, confused, kept going for a bar before faltering. He stood very still for a moment, then slowly, carefully, lowered his saxophone. He didn't look at the audience. He turned and looked at her at the piano, his eyes wide with a strange, apologetic clarity. Then, he collapsed. The gasp from the crowd was a single, horrible sound. Chaos erupted on stage. She was the first to him, kneeling beside him, cradling his head, calling his name. The curtains were rushed closed. The world outside the heavy velvet fabric was a roar of confusion, but inside, there was only a terrible, silent scream. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and cold fear. The hospital was a place of bright lights and hushed, grim voices. Their friends gathered in the waiting room. The bassist, the drummer, faces pale with shock. She sat alone on a hard plastic chair, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white. She replayed his last look, his last notes, over and over. A doctor came out, his face telling the story before he even spoke. It was his liver. It had given out. The years of searching, of pouring every bit of himself into the horn, had taken the ultimate price. He was gone. The world, which had been so full of color and sound just hours before, went gray and silent. The foundation she had built her new life upon was gone. The partnership was severed. She walked out of the hospital into the night, and the city lights seemed like distant, meaningless stars. The saxophonist, her husband, the demanding, brilliant, searching soul who had seen her in a crowd and changed her life, was silent, and the only thing left was the echo of his last words to her. "You keep playing." The silence after his death was the loudest sound she had ever known. It wasn't just the absence of his saxophone. It was the absence of his voice in the morning, the rustle of his sheet music, the weight of his listening presence in the room. Their apartment, once a sanctuary of shared discovery, felt like a museum of a life that had ended too abruptly. She wandered through it, touching his records, his books, the empty stand where his horn had lived. The grief was a physical thing, a heavy stone on her chest that made it hard to breathe for weeks. She couldn't go near the piano. The thought of making music felt like a betrayal. How could she play when the other half of the conversation was gone? The world outside moved on. There were tributes in the newspapers, special radio programs playing his music. She was asked for interviews, for comments, but she declined. She shut the door on it all. The manager who had once seen her as a background player now called with opportunities, sensing a story to sell. She had her number changed. Her only comfort was the small circle of true friends, the bassist, the drummer. They didn't offer platitudes. They just came and sat with her, sometimes in complete silence, sharing a pot of tea. The bassist, one afternoon, said quietly, "He told me, the week before, he said, she's got the map now. She knows the way." I didn't know what he meant then. She just looked out the window, tears streaming silently down her face. One rainy afternoon, she found herself standing in front of her piano. The lid was closed, dust gathering on the dark wood. She heard his voice, not as a ghost, but as a clear memory from that last day at their apartment. "You keep playing. The music needs you." It felt less like an encouragement and more like a command from the other side. A duty. With a trembling hand, she lifted the lid. She stared at the familiar pattern of black and white keys. She didn't try to play one of their songs, or anything complex. She simply pressed down on a single, low C note. The sound vibrated through the silent room, rich and lonely. She held it until it faded away. Then she played another note, a fifth above, a simple, open interval. It sounded like a question. That was how she started again, note by note, interval by interval. She didn't play jazz. She played sounds, clusters of notes that felt like her grief dance, cloudy, unresolved. She let the piano become an outlet for the wordless ache inside her. The music that came out was raw, often harsh, but it was honest. It was the only way she could speak, slowly, almost without her realizing it. The sounds began to change. The harsh clusters started to open up, revealing spaces between the notes. She began to hear other things in her mind, the drone of the Indian instrument he had loved, the harmonies of the church music of her childhood, the freedom of the jazz he had taught her. She started to weave them together, not as a tribute to him, but as a way to understand her own soul. She began composing. It wasn't like before. It was a process of meditation. She would sit for hours, exploring a single chord, seeing how many different colors she could find inside it, by touching the keys with different pressures, using the pedals to let sounds bleed into one another. The music became slower, more spacious, more spiritual. It was a search for peace. After many months, the bassist and drummer asked if they could come over and just play with her. No plans, no songs. They set up in the living room, crowded amongst the furniture. She was hesitant, afraid the old jazz language would bring back too much pain. But when she started playing one of her new, drifting pieces, the bassist didn't swing. He listened and then began to bow long, sustained notes that matched her atmosphere. The drummer used mallets, creating textures of cymbal washes and soft rumbles. They were following her into this new, quiet territory. It felt like a beginning, a different kind of partnership, a small, avant-garde club, the kind that valued exploration over entertainment. Heard she was playing again. They offered her a night, just her, no big promotion. She agreed, not for the audience, but because she needed to see if this music could live outside her living room. The night of the performance, she was terrified in a way she hadn't been since that long-ago party. This was her heart, naked and unfiltered. The club was dimly lit, half full of serious-faced people. She walked to the piano, a different woman now older, with a deep sadness in her eyes, but also a new stillness. She didn't smile. She simply began. The music she played was unlike anything the jazz world had heard from her. It was contemplative, oceanic. It built not on rhythm and melody, but on layers of harmony and texture. At times, it was so quiet the audience had to hold its breath to hear. She wasn't entertaining them. She was taking them on an inward journey. Some people shifted, confused, but many closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Near the end of her set, she paused. She looked at the keys, and for the first time that night, she allowed a fragment of the past to enter. She played a simple, beautiful variation on one of his best-known melodies, but she didn't play it with jazz phrasing. She played it like a hymn, slow and reverent, surrounded by her own new, shimmering chords. It was no longer his song. It was her memory of him, transformed by her grief and her love. In that moment, the past and the present, the loss and the healing, fused together. When the last note faded, there was a profound silence, then a deep, respectful swell of applause. It wasn't the wild roar of the famous party. It was something better. It was understanding. After that, a new path unfolded. She stopped trying to be what she was before. She embraced the role of a seeker, a composer. She recorded albums that defied category, part jazz, part classical, part pure spiritual invocation. She studied the harp, adding its heavenly glissandos to her sound. Young musicians, especially women, saw in her a powerful model, an artist who had endured profound loss and used it not to break, but to build a deeper, more personal language. Years later, she was asked to give a rare interview to a serious music magazine. The interviewer, a young woman, asked her about that legendary night at the party, the moment that launched her. She thought for a long time. That night, she said slowly, was a door opening. But what came later? The love, the loss. That was the real journey through the door. The piano at that party was an instrument. The life afterward was the music. She continued to play, to compose, to teach, for decades. Her hair turned silver, her hands a little slower, but her hearing for the truth in sound only grew sharper. She never forgot the saxophonist. His photograph remained on her piano. He was not a ghost haunting her, but a foundation, the first person who truly saw the musician she was meant to become. And on quiet evenings, when she would sit at her piano, now surrounded by her own legacy of records and scores, she would sometimes play those first, soulful chords from that long-ago party. They didn't sound the same. They were infused with a lifetime of joy and sorrow. She would play them, and in the resonance, she could hear it all: the challenge in his eyes, the roar of the crowd, the silence of the hospital, the peace of her own hard-won music. It was one long, unbroken song she had kept playing, and in doing so, she had not just honored his last request. She had found her own, true voice, one that resonated long after the final note was played, inspiring others to listen for the music within their own silence.